Just a reminder to everyone, when you're ready with a question, just to give an indication so someone can come over with a mic and give us some time to pass the mic along to whoever it is that you'd like to hear from.
Hi. My question is to Kellyanne. What can we take as a tangible example of successful communication in this citizens' jury that you mentioned?
So one of the things about this process is it's not a science. So it'd be lovely and easy for us to say that, why is it tricky? Because people are tricky and complex as part of that process. Where the tangible community consultations that have been done well and have that spirit of better together and all those things that state government talk about, and given that the previous one was done by industry, and the real difference here is that state government do it, is that there is an opportunity for those with complex views to be heard. And I think that to say that everybody has to be in favour of whatever the recommendations is always the way in which it goes into the future. And the second thing, this is not a tangible thing, and I'll come to some of the ways in which we risk that, is how defensive I see people who are trying to defend a position be as part of that process. So if we could genuinely have people crossing the room, tangibly shaking hands at the end of this, I think that was a great community concept to have. And I say that because it hasn't happened always, because there have been communities where we no longer have families that talk to each other because on their other side. And I use the wind farm debate not to pick on that industry because that's not fair. There are many industries as part of that process, but because those are the long-term complex discussions at the end. So, I can't give you a number or a figure. That's why it's complex.
Thank you, Kellyanne. Other questions?
My question is directed to Jason, and my question is that for a moment, if we think that government does decide to go ahead and do this, how do you see this as an execution model? That is it owned by government, executed by government and managed by government across the period that it will have? Or do you see that as owned by government, managed and executed by the private players? And if that is so, how do we trust the private players? Because I can quote an unrelated example, but BP has faced so many oil spillages across the world and had to do so much of cover up, right? So how do we trust those businesses that they will not be profit-making machines rather than taking care of the community? And what is the chamber's role in ensuring that it does not happen?
Well, it's not my place to say how it would be managed, but I would say that from...
Just think your personal perspective would be good.
Yeah. Well, I think at this point in time, I think from what I understand is that the government would be looking to do that because the government would be looking to take the profits from it, put it into some sort of sovereign wealth fund, and then use the proceeds of the investment, not the money they got initially, other than what you had to do to build the facilities, but to use the money to, as I said, to invest it and then use some of the profits from that to go back into the community so that you actually have a sovereign wealth fund that does actually last for not just decades or not just hundreds of years, but actually can last for thousands of years because you're only using a part of the money that comes from the profit of investing the dollars. So I would think that they would be the ones. I'm sure they would use private contractors to actually, as contractors to them to build it. Actually, in the first session, somebody asked the question about the costs of it. I think the Royal Commission has actually been very, very conservative with their figures. In fact, we've actually even been a bit, particularly on some of the other aspects that we've been interested in, we've actually been concerned that they're being too conservative, and I think this is a case where they've actually been very conservative about the costs associated with it, and actually very conservative about the money that you can get for the waste. And perhaps if I can just take a latitude, picking up on a point about, what if we don't get the money? What if we don't get the money in 70 years? The reality is the Royal Commission's identified, I think, a minimum of 15,000 tonnes required to justify the facility. And the reality is those countries that would be where we would take the waste from would actually pay up front for that. So they're not We're not worried about whether they're still paying the bill in 30, 40, 50 or 100 years' time. They would pay up front for that. That's the model, so you know you have the money in advance. You don't have to worry about, does the world change down the track?
Thanks very much, Jason. So, do you want to wait for a microphone for a second? Thank you.
Just a very small comment probably. I'm happy to have your views. I would believe it hard to digest the 4% cost of capital that the Royal Commission has used to come up to the NPV side of the things, because industry spectrum is much, much different, and I would be really struggling to understand how many businesses in the world would be using 4% as the cost of capital to calculate.
Well, I'm not sure that they use that for the cost of capital, but it actually, if the government's doing it, it's actually less than that. It's actually quite a lot less than that, their cost of capital at the present time.
Thank you. We're okay to move to another question.
This is for Jason. This is a question, a very important question. If I glow in the dark tonight, because I've had a couple of these chocolates, what do I do? What do I do?
They glow.
I don't think I really need to answer that, do I?
Just a quick question, which I asked of the previous 4 panellists. How many of you people have actually read the Royal Commission report? Some of it?
I won't say I've read every single page, but we've gone through it very extensively because we've put in lots of submissions to it as well.
Okay.
So,
Fine, thank you.
Thank you. Other questions?
Yeah, this is a question for Jason as well. You mentioned that the perceived support for nuclear in the community is quite low, even though that may not necessarily be the case. Do you have a reason why there is such a gap between actual support and perceived support?
I think it was, as I was showing before, that how we grew up, nuclear was all bad. It was the nuclear weapons, the way we were all conditioned, if you like, about it. I mean, I honestly grew up. I'm a little bit older than you are, but I grew up thinking literally that the world was going to come to an end, and because of everybody throwing nuclear weapons at each other. Best case scenario was that you might live through a nuclear winter or something like that. I mean, that's really what we all thought. Another 10 years older than I am, and there's some people in the room that are in that age, they actually practiced, or actually maybe 20 years older than I am, but they actually practiced the duck and cover in school on a regular basis. And so the fear that generated, it became a taboo subject. No one talked about it, and that's why the assumption that everyone was against it, even though community attitudes have changed over decades.
My question is for Michael. None of us really have, or that I know of, have too many worries about intermediate and low level nuclear waste because we have had experience with that. But I think more of us would be worried about the high level waste and and just wonder about that. What do you know, what are the differences between the two, between intermediate and high level that...
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is it's really just a threshold based on a number of risk factors, and one is that what the source generates. So gamma rays, something will pass through quite significant shielding, and so you need lead, you need concrete shielding. Other sorts of waste can be stopped by alpha particles, can be stopped by a sheet of paper. So that's one aspect, and then how long the source lasts for. So uranium obviously decays over quite billions of years, whereas other radioisotopes delay over a period of a week. So certainly when you have something like the blood irradiator that we have to ship to Germany, that's something that has a very significant half-life and produces gamma rays. Similarly, Lucas Heights has got a nuclear reactor, and they have fuel rods and high-level sources. So we have to apply fairly well-stated rules in terms of how we manage the waste that we generate already in Australia. And so I think that those rules are very important. And I think that similarly, we know that we have those transfers, and we have to have ways of transferring waste already. And so the other aspect is that I think that it's a very good point that I think that most of the community are quite rightly not worried about low-level waste, although one of the people on the radio on Friday was saying the same point about low versus not low-level waste, and I went home and read the advertiser on Friday afternoon that said Sarah Hanson-Young was saying that we must stop the government's plan for a low-level waste facility in South Australia, that there's significant fear about low-level waste and that this should be stopped because we don't want to be the international dumping ground. Now, I'm going to take it that that was a misquote, but it's the classic misquote that I see time and time again, that we, you know, that this is good because this is getting clarity around the fact that there's some levels of nuclear waste that we just need to be tidy in how we do it, and I don't think we're tidy enough yet, because as I say, I think there's little ways of handling it all around Adelaide. I think there's opportunities in terms of if we have a very well organised scheme to deal with waste, it doesn't stop at low, medium, high. It's basically what are the rules, the international regulations about the transit and handling of all waste, and that I'm not particularly concerned. As I say, I didn't appreciate, but we've got a plutonium source at the Royal Adelaide. We've also got a cesium source. We've got cobalt machines. We've got things that are not concerning, and I sort of thought, do I say these things because there's such a level of fear but on the other hand, every day when I drive behind a tanker with liquid ammonia or something, I know there's a waste that I'm worried about there too. So I think it's just having a number of experts that know how to deal with whatever it is that it's producing and how long it's going to be producing it.
My question's also for Michael, and it follows on from that one. You're clearly very comfortable with how we're dealing with intermediate and low-level waste, and even the proposals for the dealing with the high-level waste. What, if anything, would cause you to become concerned with human safety around any of this process?
Yeah, I think that, well, some of the questions are, and I think the first question we had, which was, you know, who owns it and what are the rules? Because I think that, you know, just dealing with waste, so taking out nuclear waste and saying chemical waste or other forms of waste, and indeed the oil industry and all those things, I think, you know, who's setting up the rules and what are the penalties and what's the plan to deal with waste? And I don't feel, I'd love to have the radiation sort of in the same discussion, that it has different concerns and different ways that we have to handle it. And obviously I'm hopefully reasonably knowledgeable on radiation, and I have no idea about BP and oil. So we've got people that can add to that debate. So I think that, you know, who owns the facility, and also how we do transit that waste, what are the risks in that regard. But also I think that this, I don't feel like I've got an answer in terms, even with the new Royal Adelaide, when we worked out how we were going to set up our department there, that I was obviously very involved with that, but my team of physicists, there was about probably 15 or 20 people that I would say are international experts in our community, that we put a lot of time into that. So I think it's the same thing. I think it's getting as many people with a knowledge of these issues to work it out, but without the fear. What I don't like is I don't want any radiation. I just think we shouldn't have it at all, because I think everybody in this room's on the journey to seeing that that can't happen. So it's how do we deal with each incremental risk.
Thank you, Michael. Can I just check, Jason, so just a quick addition to that, and I think we've got a question on behalf of a juror that Emily is going to ask.
Sure, just quickly, you did hear a little bit, I think, in the earlier session, but there is really extensive testing of the containers that would actually hold this. I mean, they literally put rocket-powered trucks into them. They try and blow them up. They, you know, incredible levels of fire and all sorts. And the containers that actually used don't actually have any, have never experienced any breach of those containers, dropping them from 6 stories high, and all of these other sorts of things. By the way, to the same container, not just do it to that one to one and that one to another one. They actually do it all to the same container. So I think in terms of those risks to people who are handling it, dealing with it, whether it's at a port, on rail, on boats, all of the way through the process, we actually do have really good, rigorous processes, and we can pick from the best world-class standards in terms of dealing with that.
Okay, I'll just go while your microphone beats up.
Okay.
So a question from a juror who doesn't want to be photographed, and maybe I'm going to start with Simon and slightly change the word. So that one of the question was, who will make these rules, the rules around how we store the waste? And maybe the little snip or the change in the question is, who should make the rules?
Well, I think ultimately, if wherever the facility is located, the government that is responsible for that area will be required to set the rules. In a sense, it's setting a precondition under which anybody can gain access to or make use of a facility if it was there. So that's the outward-facing rule setting for the world, if you like, that might want to come in and use this. How they then set those rules will be determined by the mandate that the communities provide them, and they would be necessarily taking into account, in particular, the interests and views of those who are closest to the area where that needs to be done. Now, there's always a tension between this, between the collective good of a state or a polity and the particular interests of individuals. But I would think that this is one of those areas where permission from the community is so vitally important. You find this just in mining at the moment, in lots of things in natural resources. If the community doesn't want it, if you don't have a social licence to operate, then it becomes a futile process ultimately, and that's one of the big lessons that the mining industry has learned over the years. So I'd say set by governments for the conditions under which it comes, but with a strong, attentive ear to those whose interests are most closely affected by where it's located.
Thank you, Simon. So am I right reading my colleagues' watch upside down? We have about another 10 minutes.
Yep.
And questions, how many other questions do we have?
Hello, my question is mainly for Michael as well. We've had some discussions here about the relevance of the legacy, especially in Aboriginal communities, but I think also broadly for our state, of the nuclear bomb testing at Maralinga. Partly for me, what I think the relevance of that is not just about the engagement process, but also about the long-running health effects from that exposure. Do you think that we have any lessons to learn from that experience about people's exposure to radiation and those long, and the contamination still today that I know people live with as well? And is that I think similar to the previous question over here as well about, is that a real risk? Is that?
Yeah, well, look, I think that not setting up very clear rules about how we handle nuclear waste. I mean, there are clear rules about how we handle waste, but having a consistent view and a place to put nuclear waste that is stable, that's away from the water table, that's the right spot for it, I think is an important thing to consider. When I was just looking up some things for this debate, I saw an article by one of my colleagues who was the Director of Radiation Oncology, David Wigg, when I was a student. And it was just, it was actually, he passed away only a year or so ago, but in the follow-up to Chernobyl, he made the point that there were 28 deaths, and those were the radiation workers that were sent in to clean up the initial spill. So they were the Minutemen that were always going to die, and that was horrendous that you wouldn't have rules to deal with that. And then there was something of the order of 1,500 people that died from suicide because of their concerns about radiation, which he described as really the fallacy of radiation, that those people were so worried. And then beyond that, nobody's died from that incident. That there's certainly even data that suggests, and it's reassuring to me, there was data from British radiology associations a number of years ago that low level exposure that's above what we've set as the community limit actually may have an improvement in health in terms of what's called radiation hormesis, and that a study of radiation workers in the 50s and 60s, where our controls weren't as tight as they are now, suggested that it may actually have a very low level exposure to radiation, but above what we would deem safe, might actually have a improvement in health. Now that's really hotly debated in terms of, is there a threshold where radiation causes harm versus not, and that's not answered, but it's at least throws into the debate that there's a lot of things we don't know, but it certainly gets down to obviously I don't know too much about the testing of Maralinga, but there must have been a heck of a lot of lessons we can learn from that in terms of something that was just imposed on the community, that clearly there was some pretty horrible decisions in terms of there isn't a community there maybe, or where is the wind going to blow, what are we actually using, and they're the things that we certainly need to consider. But I think now we've got plenty of good evidence that we can consider them.
Thanks very much, Michael. So we only have a few minutes left. We have one question here. Yep,
right.
thank you.
Hi, my question's for Michael again. You're popular today. Firstly, a very short question. The sort of basement storage, if I can call it that you described for Royal Adelaide and other small facilities, would that sort of situation be replicated across Australia?
Yep.
Yep, okay. In your experience, knowledge, view, have there been incidents of mishandling of that waste?
No, I think's the short answer. I stand corrected. Certainly not in our department in my time, which is 30 years. No.
Okay, thanks.
Michael, you're the rock star today. Just following on from that question, it was quite a small box, it looked like, underground with that medical waste. And if that's replicated around Australia, what size facility, if it was just for medical waste, would you see?
Look, to be honest, I don't know. I think that's probably that room. Indeed, what we're defining at the Royal Adelaide's more defined on sort of occupational work safety. What's the size of an office, sort of, So the actual, even the amount, the actual size of the waste we're dealing with is really quite small. If there was some sort of central repository, we would still deal with the transit waste. And so if I give somebody thyroid that has thyroid cancer, radioactive iodine, then the sheets and the things that they came into contact with, we would store them for the few days while their half-life and that they become safe. So that would exist. But in terms of the actual sources, the sources for like our brachytherapy and our other things are absolutely minute. So I'd be guessing it wouldn't be big. Yeah.
Thank you. I just know that Jason, as our resident engineer, would like to add something about the size of the box, and then we are done unless there is one last huge burning question in which to end on.
I just want to take your question but apply it to the high level waste. My understanding from the Royal Commission's report is you're talking about a facility about the size of Adelaide Oval. Which I did a calculation the other day. I think it's about 1/46 millionth of South Australia. So it's a very, very small area, really, when you think about it. But that would take a substantial amount of waste. There is this view that there's huge amounts of waste being generated from nuclear facilities. It's about, I think if my figures are right, and I might send this information in, I think it's about 6.5 tonnes per year of waste from a typical nuclear facility. And we aren't talking about taking all of the world's waste. The Americans don't want to give their stuff to us. They want to keep it for reprocessing at some stage down the track. The Russians, the French, the Finnish, there's lots of countries that aren't. We're actually only talking about a relatively small amount of the world's nuclear waste that we would actually take, about 15,000 tonnes at least in the first instance.
Thanks very much, Jason. And now for our final question, I hand over.
Yeah, this is
Harry.
for Simon. I sit on the advisory board to the Premier along with 3 other members in the room here. But my question is really about the ethics. You talked about 3 principles. How do we build those 3 principles into this discussion so that we can think about the shared views, the shared values, the shared direction for the future? And If we don't have a basis to work from, then we're looking at it from the way the questions have been said here, from different perspectives, and we've had 8 panel members this morning, plus yourself, talking. So how do we go back to the fundamental, and that is, what is the ethics and the principles beyond the ethics that we have to consider?
And I should say the principles I mentioned were things for you to consider. They're not necessarily the ones you must adopt. I think you've just got to go back to that basic question and ask, from the level of the Premier through to this group, are there core values? And as I say, 2 were nominated earlier on, but are there other things there which we're prepared to accept and then articulate as part of the framing of this issue? Because otherwise, every single person will have a conversation about this, and they'll seem to be in agreement, but perhaps for very opposite reasons and not even know it. And we've all seen this, where people walk away, they thought they agreed to something, and then they do something different. They say, oh, you didn't do it. And they say, no, I actually believe it, but you meant something different. So I think it's a process issue that has to be baked into what you're doing under this thing.
Thank you so much, Simon, and I think that everyone's going to get an opportunity to start to look from that perspective in our next discussion, which Emily will lead. So I think it's a great place to say thank you to all of our panellists in the traditional manner. Thank you, Dr.